I'm here with Jaime del Val at the 11th Beyond Humanism Conference in Lille, and we're talking about transhumanism and posthumanism. So my first question is, why are you taking part in this meeting?
Well, I've been participating since the first conference of the series together with Stefan, like we co-organized it somehow, and we've hosted one in Madrid, and so yeah, for me it's become like one of the most important things I do every year. It's linked to all my research and also my artistic creation, and so I've always presented also artistic work in the conferences, except this year, but I do the workshops. So it's very entangled with all the kinds of practices, and both in theory and also in artistic practices that I do with new media, with transformations of the body, and with the whole philosophy I develop around it.
Okay, and so what do transhumanism and posthumanism mean for our societies in a more general way?
Well, in general terms, I think they are important topics to think the deep transformations that are going on nowadays, and not only that, also like the way in which many fundamental categories we have considered regarding what we are and what the world is have to be also challenged, like not just looking towards the future and what's happening in the present, but also reviewing the whole tradition and many of the fundamental categories we use to describe ourselves.
Okay, and in a more particular way, how does they relate to one another, those two notions?
So I see a fundamental difference between what I would call critical posthumanism and transhumanism, and we can then even add metahumanism, which is another tradition that Stefan Sorgner and myself have initiated a few years ago. But so transhumanism is a tradition I am very critical with. It's a tradition which is very aligned with the strongest, possibly the strongest powers on the planet nowadays, which is, say, Silicon Valley corporations, technology corporations that are reshaping our societies completely. It's a tradition that I think, I sometimes refer to it as hyper-humanist, because I think it builds upon many of the worst dreams of humanism, which means issues of an eternal identity that has to self-perpetuate through immortality, dystopias, in my view dystopias, but in their view dreams of total control, and so forth. So there's a number of things which I see as highly problematic in that tradition. Whereas in critical posthumanism, it's much more minoritarian. So first of all, I need to clarify that there's a clear imbalance in power. Critical posthumanism is a minoritarian academic and partly political discourse, which on the one hand challenges many of these fundamental assumptions inherited from humanism. The idea that there is a superior species due to rationality, which is autonomous and so forth, is completely questioned in many different ways. And many of the fundamental dualistic categories we have inherited, including gender categories, but species categories and so forth. And then in terms of thinking what's going on and how to propose it differently, it's also a very different approach, because it's more about understanding how we are entangled with a world that is very complex, that is always relational, and where we need to take care of the symbiosis we have with everything in ways which are not expanding upon this colonial dream of, colonizing the entire universe with information systems and control, where I think transhumanism shows instead its more imperialistic and colonialist phase. Instead, critical posthumanism, I think, is quite opposed to that kind of colonialist, imperialistic tradition of, colonizing the entire universe through control systems and information systems, and instead trying to develop pluralities of ways of accounting for the way in which we are always in symbiosis with everything, accounting and taking care of every vulnerable category that appears within all those power struggles that are happening all the time, rather than trying to impose new kinds of power relations and elitist dreams of immortality and so forth that are extremely also unecological and unsustainable as far as I'm concerned. With metahumanism, what Stefan and I have been proposing is, we see it each of us a bit differently, but for me it builds more upon critical posthumanism. And it also acknowledges the transformative powers of technology, but I like to propose a much more creative account of how we can reinvent technology in ways in which it shapes our perception, in which it, through our movement, we can, with very subtle transformations, have deep transformations in how technologies craft us. And my account is how can we create more plastic realities, realities which are more subject to emergent processes where movements are not imposed. Mm-hmm. So for me, technologies like perspective, screens we have in our pockets, cameras and so forth, are perpetuating a tradition that is aligning us with the frames of measurement all the time. Right? And so I'd like to invent other kinds of technologies that create modes of relation of the body that don't imply those fixities.
Okay. My last question is, what do you expect the future to be like?
Well, that depends on whether we ask what I think it might be like or how I would like it to be, right? So I think the way it's running now, which of course always unpredictable things will come about, is more towards a rather dystopian kind of hyper-fascist society of control. Including, how Facebook is operating nowadays, I see as crucial part of this hyper-fascist model of sociality, of implicit social credit. Like, there is a scandal now about China in putting in place a social credit system. I don't think Facebook is any better than that. So that's how I think it's moving, but now I think it's a responsibility of all of us here in this conference to be much more critical and radical in a sense, but it's not really radical, it's just being a bit more precise about the red lines that we need to put and the questions we need to raise in terms of all these problems where I seriously question many discourses about the inevitability of what's going on or the good sides and benefits of what's going on and so forth. No, it's not inevitable, and maybe many of the needs that are satisfied are created by the system itself. So, we need to be far more critical and creative in saying, no, we can reinvent the future and the present in many, many other ways that are not this presumption that it can't be otherwise than how it's going. So I suggest that we infuse much greater doses of criticality but also of creativity in these conferences, from which much stronger arguments should come out into society. It's unbelievable that Silicon Valley companies don't have serious ethical teams that deal with these things that are shaping the world, and that governments are also absolutely ignorant and obsolete in their discourses regarding all these issues.
Sure. Thank you for answering my questions.